Mr. Sinclair.
How are you?
How are you?
I'm fine. You're in the dark.
I am. Yeah.
I've lost you back. How was your Saturday? Is it Saturday? It is Saturday.
It's Saturday. Yeah.
The problem is that, I'm so used to having, probably like you, 5 days doing things in an office and 2 days doing other things. Right now, for the last year, it's been every day we're sitting in the same place.
Yeah. I know. It's just the background. It's not my place. I'm just kidding. Yeah. It is my place. Hi, Paul. How are you?
Very good, Zach. How are you today?
Excited about today's presentation, man. I let you. I mean, not now. Whenever you're ready, you can. I let you share. So.
Thank you.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. How are you, Beverly?
Good. How are you? Happy first day of spring.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah? The 20th, huh?
Yes.
Thank goodness.
Ugh.
I mean, we should be thankful for the little things, but the being in the winter with so much closed is a problem for me, psychologically, I guess.
What is this doing?
Is it noise from my computer?
There's a noise that has just stopped
Oh, okay. Yeah.
for me.
Maybe it's in my head. Yeah. So what I want to do is before we start, I want to share a schedule pretty quickly. And again, I put some of them up there, but I'll put some more by the end of the day. So. Yeah. Meaning new presentations for April. I want the update for presentations for April, at least, because I already put some in.
Hello.
Somebody's sharing?
Oh, Michael.
Who's sharing?
Not me.
Oh, let me. This is so stupid. I don't know who's sharing. I hope we didn't get hacked again.
It says you're viewing MB Pilchman's screen.
Beverly, can you stop
Yeah.
sharing, please?
I'm sorry.
Can you stop sharing, please?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. So I just want to go over the schedule pretty quickly before we are get on with the presentation. So, today we're discussing Hellenistic I, and Paul is going to talk about it. Then we have Hellenistic II on 4-3. I just want to go down the schedule. It's going to be actually me and Marika. Marika is going to talk about philosophy and and stuff like that. So, and then I'll just continue with Hellenistic part. And she's joining right now. So
Hello, everyone.
hi, Mark. How are you?
Not too bad.
And then we will switch from Greece to ancient Nubia. We want to do a little bit of Africa. It's kind of going to be sprinkled in a little bit. We're going to have ancient Nubia, and then just going down the list, we'll have Etruscans, we'll have Ethiopia, Axum, which even though Axum is a little bit, it's not ancient, but we still. And then we're going to start on a Roman, outline. I think Greg just sent the list to Paul to review and me, and then we'll go through the list of stuff for Roman, and then we'll just decide what we want to do for Roman. It's going to be at least a year. We're going to be in Rome on Saturdays.
Oh,
so exciting stuff.
More. I would.
Too bad we can't do it in Rome, huh?
Yeah.
Well, now that we're all getting
Next time.
Who knows? Well, You know, the schedule I sent is only up to Augustus, and
Yeah, no, I need the schedule through Byzantium. I need.
Believe me, up to Augustus is already going to take us.
All right, let me just finish with the
half a year.
schedule. I'll continue that. I apologize. All right, so then, you know, we'll do Rise of Atsekes again because somebody decided to hack a harmless history group and was writing very bad annotations. And so we'll, you know, Sergio will give it another shot of 327. Reach is going to do Israeli 11 wars, inclusive of 1973 and 1967 wars. Should be a really interesting one. I had to move the stateless ethnicity because Sam that had a prior engagement 252, so that's going to be moved. We have Greg next week is going to do, you know, Plato apology. Already had 20 people signed up, so Greg, you're under pressure.
It's all ready. It's going to be kind of similar to what I did with Plutarch, because it's fairly short, but there is a lot of interesting points.
If you guys can read it, you know, it's not a, you know, fairly large piece.
But you don't really have to read it if you don't want to, because we're gonna read parts of it together.
Okay, perfect. Then I don't know if Alex is on. If you want to do Plutarch, Alcibiades, if not, then just let me know. We can assign somebody else. And Joshua, who wrote a book on Viking and Andalusia, will have on 331. It's on the schedule. You know, fairly interesting subject. Ancient weaponry tomorrow. Jonathan is doing it, and it's interesting. His wife has decided she wants to also do a piece for medieval music. So
cool.
we'll have a medieval music piece, just kind of, you know, switch gears a little bit on
That's totally cool.
516 that she had a time on that.
That's awesome. That would be great.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
I'm actually also, you know, trying to, you know, ask her if she could. She's actually a music teacher, has a PhD in that, so she'll present that. Then, you know, we'll have. Let me just admit people. 1 minute is on. All right, so we'll have Mark is going to present in 1940 France. So it'll be an interesting one. And again, I posted a picture up there of Hitler in Paris, but Mark, you could just correct me if I could change that picture if you offended or anything.
Yeah, I'll send you something.
Yeah, I could change that picture. I apologize. This is not something that I was trying to point out or anything. I apologize.
Chuck, I'm sorry, at what time is this? 4:10?
410 is on Saturday at 12, regular time.
Okay,
Yeah, it does, nothing changes as far as how we change
okay.
times. Yeah. Marika, I told them that we're doing Hellenistic II. You ready for the philosophy piece on 4.3?
Yes.
Yes, you're the best.
I'm not ready, but that's okay.
Hey, no, it's fine.
I will be ready. So, and that's the third
Correct.
at 12?
The third is coming out to, what is that? Hold on a second. I'll have to look at the schedule. Let me see. 4.3 is coming out to, no, that's gonna be 12.
At 12?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So then let's just continue down the schedule. Anne is going to do history of American Cup. If you guys are into sailing, I'm still going to continue, you know, that painful presentation on history of soccer, World Cups. Then we have a lot of subject history. Anne is going to do Dutch East India Company on 4.1. Paul is going to do on 4.8 history of mining and metallurgy. And I'll do the history of gunpowder, unless somebody wants to step up and take over. I'm never shy of transferring it over. And Anne is going to do how Aristotle got to the Western world, from obviously, you know, transference from the Arab world. And then Lisa is going to do Amarna period of Egypt. Okay, so we're kind of going back a little bit. So That's that. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to let Paul share.
Okay.
Hey, John, how are you?
I'm fine.
How are you feeling?
Oh, okay.
Good, good, good.
So let me introduce Fredo to everybody.
Hey, Fredo.
And his brother Santino is not in the picture.
So cute.
Yes, he really looks like that.
How old? How old?
Just 5 years old.
Oh, okay, not awesome.
So this is a kitten picture.
Oh, wow, wow. You got him from somewhere or you bought him?
We bought him.
Oh, okay. Nice.
And yeah, he and his brother, Maine Coons. Let me start with the standard disclaimer that I'm Paul, and like all of you, I'm a history buff. I'm not a professor. I'm not a historian. I'm not a PhD, though I understand some of you actually are PhDs, but I'm not one of you. So I'm just sharing what I've learned, and just for the joy of doing it. Today's my presentation on the Hellenistic world is largely based on a course that I took about 5 years ago with Professor Richard Billows, who's an expert in the Hellenistic world, who wrote a book on Antigonus I and some other scholarly works on the Hellenistic world, as well as some works for general audiences. And this was a one semester course on the Hellenistic world, and I have copious notes, and that's really the basis for what we're doing today. So, the ground rules, as I've often said, are that there are no rules. I welcome comments, questions, really at any time. Don't feel shy. Just speak up. It makes a more exciting and interactive presentation. Okay. There we go. Let me just see if I need to. There we go. Okay. So the Hellenistic world. This title, what does it mean to be Greek? I'm not going to explain it right now, but I think that it will become clearer as I go through the presentation when I'm driving at. What we're looking at here on the left is a very famous statue from pieces of bronze from the Hellenistic world. It's called the Seated Boxer. It's a very modern looking piece in a certain way because of the emotion, the realism, the scars on his face, and it's kind of everything that classical Greek art was not. So this is a piece of classical Greek art called the Blonde Ephebe, and when you compare it to the boxer, what's really jumps out as you is that the boxer is a portrait. That could be a real person. And the Blonde Ephebe is idealized. That could never be a real person. This is an idealistic view of something. What that many scholars have said that these classical pieces really are kind of civic symbols of the activity of the Greek polis, the city-state. And here's another shot. Now this on the right is an Apollo from the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. And if you look at his head, I'm going to go back. I really had to study this for a long time to convince myself that it wasn't the same head. If you look at it, they are so similar. And it just emphasizes the ideal nature of the classical period, the ideal proportions of the body, And once again, we compare it to the battered, kind of dejected picture of the boxer. And I think, at least for the way I feel about it, there's something very modern about the Hellenistic sensibility that is much closer to us than the classical sensibility. So with that, let's talk about how that happened. I'm not going to be talking about battles and leaders and so forth. I think that's been covered very well in the last several presentations on Alexander and on the Diadochi. But what I'm mostly going to be talking about today is how the Hellenistic world functioned, how governance functioned, and what made it tick.
Where is the boxer today, actually, that you're showing?
It is in Italy. I'm not. I believe it's in Rome, but I'm not absolutely certain of that. It was on loan to the Metropolitan in New York for a while.
Yeah, it was a couple of years ago. I saw it there.
And in fact, if you look on YouTube, there's a video by Gay Talese, who is a New York Times sports writer, and he talks about the boxer as the boxers that he actually covered for the New York Times, and it's really kind of interesting, and speaks to my point of how modern this sensibility is. So this is a map of the Assyrian Empire at its height. It took maybe 150, 200 years to establish this. And the reason that I'm showing it is to basically reflect on the fact that when the Assyrian Empire ended, they left nothing behind them for us to remember them by. They weren't rediscovered until the 19th century. Their own language, which was a dialect of Babylonian or Akkadian, was not the language of their empire. Their language was Aramaean, which was a language that comes from Syria. And as I say, when they fell, there was... Yeah.
Quick question. Okay, you said something that surprised me. So the Assyrian language, ancient language, bears no relationship with the language that is spoken by Assyrians today?
I think the Assyrians, which is Syriac, is Aramaic. Is a form. I mean, John, you're better positioned to speak to this than I am. If you want to comment.
Yeah, they're all Semitic languages. So the modern Assyrians are a Christian group.
Yes, yeah.
And their connection to the ancient Assyrians is very murky.
Oh, really?
Ethnically, I'm sure they have the Assyrian blood, but it hasn't been possible to trace that. Culturally, there's no connection though. So
interesting. When you talk to them, they make that direct connection.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't question it. It's a sort of a foundational claim. It's somebody's nationalism, but
yeah,
the connection is actually quite murky. What Assyrian genes and Akkadian genes are all over the place in Mesopotamia, but I'm not aware of any studies tracing percentages of genes and things like that.
And a subsequent question, Paul, if you don't mind. You said that the Assyrians left nothing for us to study or to know about?
No, I'm saying that the Assyrians essentially disappeared until they were rediscovered by archaeologists in the 19th century.
And the reason for that is?
Well, the reason is that they didn't really they didn't have a plan or a policy that resulted in any sort of cultural survival.
I would have thought they would have left clay tablets.
Sure. Sure.
That's what was discovered.
But bear with me a little bit, and you'll see in just a couple of slides the point that I'm making here.
Okay, thanks.
Paul,
I think it's not quite correct to say they were completely forgotten. They're kind of the bad guys of the Hebrew Bible.
Oh, sure. Sure.
But the physical remains, the palaces, most of them were mainly burnt. Clay tablets were found in palaces. The successive peoples just kind of ignored them, and they turned into these vast trash dumps,
Right.
called
My
tells.
point is that they made no attempt to
Yeah,
basically export their culture. There was no Assyrian settlement outside of the Assyrian heartland. Rather, their state was an extractive state in which they basically seized as much wealth as they possibly could from their empire until there was such dissatisfaction that they were overthrown and hated universally.
Paul, if I can make a comment here just to reinforce what you're saying. Actually, archaeology, the study of ancient ruins, really never emerged until the 19th century.
Yeah.
When Herodotus did his histories, it was completely a compilation of oral histories and stories, and later became writing. But the idea of actually going back and trying to recover ruins and artifacts and things of that sort, that just really never existed until the 19th century. Thanks.
Yeah,
Great.
and if I may add, I remember from the course I took on ancient Assyria, they seemed to be bilingual. They both wrote and spoke Assyrian, which is the Akkadian dialect, and Aramaic, and they actually wrote usually simultaneously in two languages as well.
Right. And the Assyrian Babylonian dialect was written in cuneiform, but
Right.
the Aramaic language was written in an alphabet, a true alphabet.
Exactly, and it was much easier to write. And we're talking about Neo-Assyrian Empire after the alphabetic code was created. But all the official documentations within the empire, like the royal correspondence, was mostly done in cuneiform, and because it was harder to decipher. Very few people could read it.
Yeah, there's
So-
a settled versus Bedouin distinction here too. A large part of the empire, this is true of all periods, all empires. There, a great many of the peoples were Bedouin, as we would call them now, not Arabs, but people who were nomads, practiced transhumance, moving their flocks on a seasonal basis. And we don't have much of a record of them at all. And they presumably were most of the Aramaic speakers of the time, where Assyrian was more urban, more upper class. I think overall, Paul is right that the Assyrians did not have much of a cultural impact. Their interests were political and military. They derived most of their high literary culture from Babylonia, which was a distinct empire. But were they very creative culturally? No, not really. They maintained Babylonian culture for a long time, though.
We should also say they were tremendously influential on the Greeks.
Yeah.
And a lot of their culture and the art of Mesopotamia and of the Near East reached the Greeks during the period of Assyrian ascendancy. So moving on, here we have the Persian Empire, kind of in the same place but much bigger. But like the Assyrians, and to a certain extent even more than the Assyrians, the Persians specifically left the native cultures intact and were quite happy. And in fact, they adopted Aramaean as the official language of the Persian Empire, and their language, which is an Indo-European language, has no relationship at all to the Semitic language of Aramaic. And their whole policy was based on the idea of basically allowing people to stay with their native culture, encouraging that, and as long as they paid their tribute to the great king, and as long as they didn't revolt, that was a great deal for everybody. And when they collapsed, once again, in the places that were outside of the Persian heartland, I think really a minimal impact culturally. Now we have Alexander. And here is Alexander on this whirlwind tour. These both of these empires, the Assyrian and the Persian, took more than 150, 200 years to actually establish. Alexander did this in 10 years, from 333 to 323, and all over the place that fast. But here's the difference. These are the cities that were established during the Hellenistic period. And this is just a few of them. There were hundreds of cities established during the Hellenistic period. This was a permanent cultural transformation of the world. It became a Greek world. And it was qualitatively different for that reason from any of the empires that came before it. For example, we see the New Testament written in Greek. We see the books of the Maccabees who revolted against the Greeks written in Greek. So what was it about Hellenism, or the Hellenistic world, that was so completely different that allowed something like this to happen? Well, first, what were the Hellenistic kingdoms? They were military monarchies. And the term that they used for their empire was, they called it Doriktikos Koros, which means spear one land. It was, what our lawyers today would call the term of art. And it was it meant that they had legitimate possession, just as if they had purchased it. They won it by right of conquest. Spear one land. And in addition to the spear one land, which is also called the king's land, there was the king's people, Lao Basilikoi, Basiliki. These were the people, the agricultural population who lived on the land, and they were considered part of the property. They were like, if there was a barn that came with the property, so did the peasants who lived there. Then there was the king's tribute, which was ultimately the purpose of empire. And the king's tribute was 10% of production a year, payable in cash. Cash, that's really unusual. And we'll get to how that worked. And as a military monarchy, the army was seen in two distinct parts. There was a core standing army that was located very close to the king. And there were garrisons at strategic locations. So I'm going to read an anecdote. This is from The City of God by St. Augustine. And he tells the story of a pirate captured by Alexander the Great. And Alexander demanded of the pirate, "What do you mean by seizing ships on the sea?" And the pirate replied, "What do you mean by seizing the whole earth? Because I do it with a petty ship, I'm called robber, while you who does it with a great fleet are called emperor." Spear one land. And this basically was the source of legitimacy, followed by all of the successors after that, so that Ptolemy, who held Egypt, claimed that it was his legitimately because of his victories over Perdiccas in 320 and over Antigonus and Demetrius at Gaza in 306.
Paul?
Yeah.
Sorry, a question. So the Greeks, they established the city, and how do they communicate? Everybody has to learn Greek? How do they communicate? How do they control? How do they?
Let me ask you to hold that one, because I'm
Okay,
going to be covering that in some depth. But that's the key question. So Seleucus was called the Seleucus Nicator, which means victor. Nike, when you think of Nike shoes, that means Nike was the Greek goddess of victory. And that was the basis for all of these kings, saying that they were the legitimate holder of their land. And I'll add that Hellenistic kingship was very, very personal. So the king held these things personally because of his accomplishments. And when he made treaties were made directly with the king as a person, not with an abstract state or an abstract nation. And when the king died, and let's say that as happened occasionally, there was a peaceful transition to the king's son or something like that, everybody would have to renew their treaties and renew whatever they had been granted by the predecessor king, because everything was done so personally. So, mechanisms of control, standing army, and the Seleucid center was Apamea on Orontes, right? This is the Orontes River over here, and it was their military center for the Seleucids. There were studs for horses and elephants. The size of his army is around 40,000 soldiers full-time. And he had strategic garrisons. Seleucia on Tigris, which was to control the very rich areas of Mesopotamia, and Apamea Kibotos in Asia Minor in the west. These were the key garrisons for the Seleucids. For Ptolemy in Egypt, his key center was Alexandria, and in the city of Alexandria, there was a huge section of the city that was devoted to garrisons for the troops. And he established garrison at Pelusium. This, in all of Egyptian history, the key is always to stop people who were attempting to invade Egypt coming down through Palestine. And Pelusium on this easternmost tributary of the Nile, or branch of the Nile Delta, was the key position for protecting Egypt from invasion from the east. In the south at Elephantine, he had a garrison which was basically to overawe the Nubians and the Ethiopians, make sure that they understood that they couldn't mess around. And Memphis, which was traditional center of Egyptian power, this was to basically to impress the Egyptians. Mainland Greece had different issues, very different issues. Unlike Egypt and Asia, there has been in those places no tradition of independent rule, and that was very different than in Greece, where they had this several hundred-year tradition of city-states, polis. And the Greeks took very, very badly to being garrisoned and dominated, even though it was necessary to do that because they would revolt. But the idea was to try to do it with as light a hand as possible, because it was very, very expensive to try to keep a hold on them. And they developed this concept of what was called the fetters of Greece, which was on the Isthmus of Corinth, which controls all land communication between the Peloponnese and the rest of mainland Greece. Chalkis, which is a city on the Long Island of Euboea, which controls this inland body of water, which was really the only safe route for commerce and shipping. If you went around the outside, and I think the Persians found this to their great dismay when their fleet was very largely destroyed by a storm. So you wanted to stay inland if you could, and Chalcus totally controlled this passageway. And the third place was Demetrius, which is in Thessaly, which controls north-south movement and this very important harbor. So these were the main ways of maintaining control of Greece. And the other way that you dealt historically with the Greek cities was by manipulating their internal factions. So this is an oversimplification, but let me just put out the basic idea is that the Greek cities, not all of them, but many of them, had what were basically oligarchic or aristocratic factions and democratic factions. And when I say democracy, we can take that with a grain of salt. Sure, there was a true democracy in Athens, and but in a lot of places it was really the rule by demagogues who would control the crowd. And the way that these cities would operate is when one faction would gain control of the city, they would exile, they would kill the most egregious of their enemies, but they would mostly exile their opponents. And then the exiles would then look around for allies to intervene. So if the democracy took over the city and exiled the oligarchs would look around for other cities with oligarchic rulers and get them to basically sponsor an invasion to restore them, and vice versa. And the Macedonians took great advantage of this. The Macedonians in general supported oligarchies. They found that much more palatable to their way of looking at the world. And they played these factional games big time. And it did make them quite unpopular in mainland Greece. And we'll see that this kind of fueled civil war and unrest throughout this period.
Paul, a question. Were the Macedonians regarded as sort of one tribe or one group among the Greeks, or were they regarded as foreigners? How were the Macedonians seen by the mainland Greeks?
That's an interesting question. So what we know is that one of the Macedonian royal house was called the Argeids. And one of the Argeids was denied the right to participate in the Olympic Games until he was able to demonstrate that his roots were from Argos. So it was accepted kind of generally that the Macedonian royal house was Greek, but it was less so with the Macedonian population as a whole. Macedon itself was divided into two main parts, really, which was Lower Macedonia, which was the lowlands, and Upper Macedonia, which was mountainous. And the further you got into the mountains, the less civilized it was, the less Grecophile it was. But in the urban centers, it was very Hellenic. And as we know, Aristotle was brought in to be the tutor of Alexander. And it was, but they had customs that were very distasteful to the Greeks. So one example was polygamy. The Greeks did not practice polygamy. The Macedonians practiced it on a wide scale.
But I always thought that the Greeks always thought the Macedonians were kind of barbaric. They were not part of the civilization. They were kind of outsiders, like very provincial,
Well,
very,
that's what I'm saying. But
okay.
but let me say one other thing about that. That a lot of what we hear of accusations of the Macedonians as being barbarians come from their political opponents in the cities. So most notably Demosthenes, who was the great enemy of the Macedonians, and he wrote his great tracts called the Philippics, which were these diatribes against King Philip, in which he resorted to every insult in the book. So a lot of the depictions of the Macedonians as just being completely barbaric are exaggerations on the part of their political opponents, who were greatly threatened by them. And there were others who had different attitudes, in particular a philosopher and orator named Socrates, who I'm going to speak with later, and who basically regarded Philip as being the hope of uniting the Greeks in a pan-Hellenic action to expand Greek culture throughout Asia. The other thing that but the Macedonians did have a reputation as being drunkards and carousers, and in particular, they were seen as people who did not water their wine. The Greeks drank their wine watered down, 1 part water to 2 parts wine. And it's a trope that barbarians didn't do that. So, for example, the Odyssey, which I spoke about a few weeks ago, when Odysseus wanted to put the Cyclops to sleep, they gave him unwatered wine. And as a barbarian, Cyclops was a symbol of barbarians. He drank the wine, he got drunk, he passed out, and they took out his eye and so forth. So that was a symbol for the Greeks of having a barbarian attitude. But it's like we're listening to a lot of political propaganda. So we have to see that's the lens through which the Macedonians are presented as barbarians. There's probably some truth to it, but not as much. You can't take it as for whole cloth and just believe the whole thing, because it's too much in the political interest of the people that were making those attacks.
You take it from where it comes, right?
Pardon me?
You take it from where it comes. I mean,
Yes,
who is saying it? So
absolutely. That's the way, by the way, to judge every ancient document. Every ancient document has to be seen from the point of view of who wrote it and what was their intent. What was their agenda?
Still today.
But for the ancient world, it's people tend to overlook that because there's such little documents that survive. So when you get a document that says something, there's a tendency to say, well, this must be it because we don't have anything else. In the modern world, we have, you read the New York Post and you read the New York Times, and you get 2 different views of the world. But imagine if, 2,000 years from now, the only thing that people saw was the New York Post. They'd have a very different view of the world than we see it now. And
it's what's not said sometimes is very important, just linguistically. Alexander spoke perfect Attic Greek, as far as we know. He had Aristotle as a tutor. The Macedonian upper elites were completely Atticized as much as they could. We never hear, you can correct me, Paul, if I'm wrong, you never hear Alexander being criticized for the quality of his Attic Greek. But that's very different from people in the countryside, the non-elite Macedonians. It's a good question whether Macedonian Greek was even comprehensible to Southern Greeks. I mean, we just don't have information about that. But they called them barbarians, so they probably did have trouble understanding it, much sometimes as we do Scottish.
Though I doubt whether they could
Greek.
not. understand the Alexander's circle, the elite Macedonians. I think there are references to them having a recognizable accent,
Hmm.
but no Greeks ever said that they were unable to understand
Yeah.
or
And the
Antigonus
Greeks-
or any.
The Greeks were such snobs, they would have pointed it out if Alexander's Greek was faulty. His Attic Greek, I should say. Because linguistically, it's pretty clear. The Macedonians spoke Greek. The main dispute scholars have today is, was it just another dialect of Greek, or was it a sister language of Greek? If it was a sister language of Greek, it could have been like Norwegian and Swedish, where you couldn't understand it. A speaker of one couldn't understand it off the bat, but with a little bit of work they could. Portuguese and Spanish is similar. But the Greek, they certainly had they didn't regard them as fully Greek. Just the backwoods cousins, I think.
So, moving on. As Alexander went through his conquests, he was moving so fast that he didn't really have time, and as far as we know, he really had very little interest in thinking about how to administer his empire. So basically what he did is he took the Persian system, which divided the empire into provinces, which were called satrapies, and the governors of those provinces were called satraps. And Alexander just replaced the Persian satraps with Macedonian generals, and kept going without much time to stop and think about what to do about that. As we'll see, I think throughout this presentation, we'll see that a lot of the innovations, a lot of the thinking about how to make the empire sustainable came from Antigonus I, who, and also I think Professor Billows, who wrote the book on Antigonus I, was perhaps a little prejudiced in his favor. But a lot of the things that we'll see were innovations by Antigonus, who was, and I'll say this in general about Alexander's generals, they were an incredibly competent group of men. They were accomplished, they were smart, they were courageous, and
When
really,
you say competent, you mean educated? They knew how to distribute things and manage things, or what?
they knew how to control power. They knew how to be effective soldiers. They knew how to administer their empire in such a way as to promote stability. They were politically astute. They knew how to maneuver politically against their opponents. They knew how to manipulate those levers of power that they could get their hands on. They were not bumblers, is what I'm saying. And so the administration became a combination of Philip's system, and there's a modern statue of Philip in which I think Greg's talked about, and it was a combination.
Skopje.
He's a communist.
It's in Skopje, the capital of North Macedonia.
And on the right, a picture of the Persians. So the system that emerged was a hybrid. So here is Philip's system. The Argead dynasty was at the top. And by the way, I said that citizen of Argos, there is the connection of the idea of tracing their roots to the Greeks in Argos. Then the highest group of people closest to the king were the bodyguards, called the bodyguards, Somatophylakis. And then around them, the companions, the hetaroi, and there were different types of companions. Many of the companions were the cavalry, which was the elite arm of the Macedonian military establishment, but there were also other high generals who were also hetaroi. And this was basically the structure. And these people formed what was called the Synedrion, which was essentially the council. And when we say council, we don't mean that this was any sort of democratic cabinet or anything like that, but they did have councils with the king. They would provide advice, and they were the people that had the most influence on the king. And I believe that the word synagogue comes from Synedrion. And here's the adaptation of this that was made during the Hellenistic period. So the Argaea dynasty was now the Hellenistic kings, and the most prestigious people in the kingdom were the Macedonian elite. But they were a very thin layer, and they were called the Philoi, which means friends, or in particular the friends of the king. Then there were the Greek Philoi, and then finally, and there were some more than others, once again, Antigonus was a pioneer here of bringing non-Greeks into this circle of influence and access to the king. And one comment that people have wondered is why the word heteroi, companions, was not continued into the Hellenistic period. And Professor Billow suggests that the Hellenistic kings themselves had been heteroi. So they didn't want to point to their non-royal lineage. So they needed some new terms to refer to the people who were around them.
By the way,
the word Hetaira, maybe it was a little bit different insinuation. I'm just curious.
Well, and what you're referring to is that heteroi were also the name for high-class call girls,
right,
in the classical period. And I don't think that degrades the heteroi of Alexander more than it elevates the women of classical Greece. I mean, it was a respected position, as you well know. Pericles' lifelong partner was a hetera. These were people of tremendous education and erudition and influence. So
Caius of Athens was the hetera of Alexandria, one of his companions.
Right. So yes, the words are very related, but as I say, I think the way to understand that is to elevate the concept of the women heteroi rather than to see it as a satire of the men.
By the way, the term back to the Synedrion, it's interesting because there's a synod is a collection of bishops,
right,
that have to approve something for the new prime minister every time in Britain. It's the synod of the Church of England's bishops.
Yes, I mean it's really quite. It's quite extraordinary just to see how many of these, Greek technical terms survive in modern usage in very much the same way as they meant and existed in the ancient world. In this scenario, in this situation, Philip was able to kind of change the composition of the Synedrion because of his military success. He was less dependent on the elite Macedonian aristocracy, and he was able to bring in people with less of nobility who would have more of a personal loyalty to him, and ultimately to bring in non-Macedonians. So people, we've talked somewhat about Eumenes, who was a Greek who was the secretary first of Philip and later of Alexander, and then became an independent general and was the arch adversary ultimately of Antigonus, though they were originally friends. So he was one of the Greeks that originally came to the court of Philip and became a member of the Synedrion, and he was very close friends with Antipater, who became the regent who ruled Greece while Alexander was on his conquest. He was the highest ranking Greek after Alexander, particularly because Alexander had no grown children. And so Philip already had gone some way into bringing upward mobility, if you will, into his royal circle, and that was a tendency that was followed and accelerated by his successors. He rewarded his people with land, often conquered land, and we noted that only the Argeids could appoint hetaroi. So once again, that's probably the reason that in the Hellenistic world, the top people were called philoi and not hetaroi. One thing that we haven't talked about, and I'm not going to get into it in great detail now, but in the early part of the Hellenistic period, there's a conflict between those followers of Alexander who are maintaining loyalty to the Argead dynasty, sometimes real loyalty and sometimes lip service. So in particular, the most important figure is Antipater. And Eumenes, who I just spoke about, was also known for his loyalty to the dynasty. As in comparison to those of the Diadochi who broke away and said, let's go off on our own, Ptolemy being the great example, and Seleucus and Antigonus. So a lot of the initial conflict was based around that sort of friction. So in terms of the way the kingdom was administered, the Persian system, you had the king in the army and the royal court. And then you had these satrapies, which were very, very large. There may have been in all of what is now modern Turkey, maybe there were 6 or 8 of them, which are pretty big geographic units. And in order to kind of protect himself against revolutions and revolts, the Persian king separated military and civil power. So they had garrison commanders in the provinces, but they reported directly to the king, not through the satrap. And then subsidiary to the satrap were a whole bunch of officials who handled correspondence and basically made sure that the tribute flowed. And here is what happened in the Hellenistic period. So king, army, Synedrion instead of royal court. But then we get to one of the first major innovations by Antigonus, which was that he broke the satrapies into much, much smaller pieces. This made it much more difficult. It diluted the power of, it atomized the power of the next level, and it reduced people that could threaten the king. And instead of calling them satraps, they were called strategos, which is Greek for general. So it emphasized the military nature of that role. And then underneath them, they had the position that was called chiliarch or kiliarch. So the kil is like we talk now about kilograms, 1,000. Arch is archon, which means ruler or leader. So the kiliarch is the leader of 1,000 sub-provinces. And the kiliarchs were the ones that went, that had responsibility for going to the local villages and accessing the harvest and supervising the transformation of crops into cash, because the tribute in the Hellenistic system had to be paid in cash. On the edge,
Paul,
yeah.
Paul, this is Lisa. A question about where does religion fit into this? Do priests have any power at this particular point in time?
I'm actually going to be talking about that.
Great, thank you.
But but just to say that in general in Greece, the role of priests was not. You did not have organized doctrines or orthodoxies that you see in Judeo-Christian or even in Islam. Basically, you have a greatly, all of the Greek gods had their local aspects. So you had Zeus, but there were many Zeuses. There was the Zeus of Dodona. There was Zeus of Molossia. They were basically local gods who then were seen as having something in common, and gradually, and that's why one reason why Homer is pointed to as being the creator of the Greek consciousness was of his kind of establishment of this central pantheon of the Greek gods who were seen by all Greeks. But there was no clergy in the way that we think of it in the modern world. There were priests associated with temples, and the great temples could have a great deal of wealth and influence, like the Oracle of Delphi, of Apollo at Delphi, and that had great political influence, but they didn't spread, and there was no tentacles reaching out from religious centers to other places in the way that you would have a hierarchy in modern religions.
Oh, just a quick, maybe it's just something you're going to talk about to touch on the relationship with Jews at some point. I don't know.
I will get to that, though, not hugely, but I'll get to that later on. I mean, we're we're up here in Asia Minor. We're going to get down to Palestine. One
thing is during the classical times, and then maybe this is not related to this particular topic. When we talk about Themistocles, who won, essentially his strategy won the war against Xerxes. He was eventually exiled and died in Persia. Was there a concept? This concept kind of translated to Hellenistic world, and they still had that same fact where, let's say, somebody like Ptolemy or Seleucus, whatever. If they weren't the winners, were they also exiled? And now you have nowhere to exile because the whole world is Hellenistic now.
Well, that was a feature of the city-states,
right?
That's the factional aspect of the city-states that I was talking about earlier, and it was actually these Hellenistic kingdoms that blew up this way of the city-states interacting with each other. They replaced the Persian Empire. So, in fact, during this earlier period, when you look at the Peloponnesian War and the period after the Peloponnesian War, even though the Persians were defeated in the Persian invasions of Greece, in fact, the Persians determined the outcome of all the wars in Greece by swinging their support and their money, because the Persians were immensely rich and they controlled huge resources. So if they felt that the Athenians were the threat that they were worried about, they would throw their support to the Spartans, and they would provide Sparta with the money to build a fleet to compete with the Athenians. So that's the scenario of Themistocles fleeing to the Persian court. is that Persia was deeply involved in these Greek political situations and transferring their support from one to another, and that ended with the Hellenistic period.
Right.
So the first piece that I covered were the great kingdoms, and they were essentially, ultimately there were three of them, which would be the Macedonian kingdom, the Asian kingdom of the Seleucids, and the Egyptian kingdom of the Ptolemies. By the way, the Ptolemies didn't really consider themselves Egyptian for quite a while. Cleopatra was the first of the Macedonian rulers to actually take a very serious interest in Egyptian history and religion and actually learn to speak Egyptian. And Alexandria was never considered to be in Egypt. Alexandria was referred to as Alexandria on Egypt, not in Egypt. So around the large kingdoms, there would be fluctuating these smaller principalities, small states that were ruled by people known as dynasts. I'm jumping ahead of myself. Let me jump back a little bit first to talk a little bit more about this. The nature of this system was that about 50% of the wealth that was collected in the kingdom would get skimmed off the top before it got to the center. But there was so much to go around that it really didn't make a dent in what the king had, and it was kind of in his interest to see that everybody had a piece of the action. And the phyloi became the really influential people in the kingdom. If you wanted something from the king, the way that you had to do that was to develop a relationship with one of the phyloi who would be able to bring your petition or what you wanted to the attention of the king. So we have records of all sorts of decrees by the Greek cities, basically praising different phyloi, basically trying to butter them up and make them, flatter them and gain their support for the stuff that they wanted from the king, which was typically exemption from taxes. And that was kind of how it worked. The phyloi were army officers, they were garrison commanders, they had command of units or entire campaigns, they had diplomatic posts, they were envoys to the cities, they were financial overseers. A Greek named Aristodemus of the city of Miletus was a close advisor of Antigonus and was the one that placed the diadem on his head. The Greeks didn't have crowns. The symbol of a king was something called the diadem, which was in fact just a ribbon that they would tie around their head. The Greeks were, ostentatious in a number of ways, but not typically in that. And then, as I said, the phylois was an emphasis on the Greeks, but some kings had non-Greek phylois. Cydonia, Egyptians primarily used to deal with non-Greek citizens and people. In compensation for phylae, lodging, food, allowance, horses, bullion, but most important, retirement gifts of land, known from inscriptions, letters concerning Aristodicus getting gifts from Antiochus. And as I mentioned, this spear-won land, the Dorictikos Kora. When you got a grant of land, that also meant that you got a grant of serfs, very similar to, what we know about the Tsarist Russia, that they were part of the furnishings.
Paul,
Yeah.
one question. When you say they collect taxes, I mean, did they go to one center, like in Egypt, they went to one place, the taxes, or they were kind of local,
They were
smaller?
They were collected
provinces?
locally and they were funneled to the center. And as I said, that was a very leaky process.
And there was one center, or there was several centers? That's my question.
The center was wherever the king was.
Okay.
Right. So wherever the king was, that's the center. That's where the treasury was. That's where things were designed to end up. And there would be regional concentration points because these were huge empires and geographically, so you had to concentrate them somewhere. In fact, when Antigonus finally was able to defeat Eumenes, and Eumenes was operating at that time in Iran, and a lot of people were expecting Antigonus to continue eastward. He didn't do that. Instead, he took a south and a westward path and passed through all of the major centers of the Persian Empire, basically taking all of the gold, silver, bullion, and coins that they had. And he collected ultimately what were called 35,000 talents. Now, a talent is a measure of weight, and 35,000 talents in the book that I was reading was equated to 15 billion English pounds, just a staggering amount of money. So that's the sort of resources that the Asian kings had to dispose of. To make a contrasting point, that was the wealth of the Seleucids, and it was the wealth of the Ptolemies. What was the wealth of the Macedonian kingdom and people who controlled Greece? Because they didn't have the Nile Valley, they didn't have the Fertile Crescent, which were these hugely productive areas. Their wealth was human wealth. They had the Macedonians and they had the Greeks. And these were the soldiers. These were the administrators. So the wealth that they controlled was human wealth. Okay, so I had a lot of stuff here on how.
Paul, I'm sorry, but human richness, but where about the taxes? I mean, the cities in Macedonia, they didn't grow up like over the top at the time. So the taxes were not arriving there, or they were not spent there.
Well, I mean, it was a lot harder to collect tribute from the Greek cities because they would resist much more strongly. They weren't used to it. They saw it as a in Yiddish they would say a shanda, a shame,
Offense,
an embarrassment, But in the East and in Egypt, this is what they'd been doing for 1,000 years. So it was just a question of, the last guy wore a turban, now this guy wears a diadem. So it was, and there was much more wealth to go around. In fact, the reason that there were Greek mercenaries around the world is because they had to hire themselves out because Greece was poor. But Greek soldiers were in demand around the world. And that was basically one of their main ways of obtaining wealth.
Paul, but one question, because I'm thinking, like, for example, in Spain, with all the gold, all the silver came from the Americas, the country was a disaster. It became a disaster. When all the richness reached, I mean, in Egypt, they build these incredible cities and they spend millions and millions of manpower in creating these, I don't know, thousands of statues. I don't know, the English, when they have India, the cities in England and the town hosts and everything was to the top. What happened in Macedonia? They didn't spend it like that. They pay the soldiers. That's where the taxes were spent.
Largely, yes. Largely, yes. But when you get into the rest of the Hellenistic world, you start getting the seven wonders of the world. You get the Colossus of Rhodes. You get the lighthouse of Alexandria. You get the fabulous riches of the city of Pergamum, because they had money up the wazoo.
And it was spread out. That's my point.
Well, it was concentrated in particular places, but there were a lot of them around. So,
Okay.
and that brings us into this question of these dynasts. These were places on the fringes of the great powers, where the great powers were not really able to consolidate their control, and these dynasts were able to exercise considerable autonomy, and they would kind of wax and wane. So when the Hellenistic kings would be weak, when they would have civil wars, then the smaller kingdoms could take advantage of it, and they could spread. And then the king, when he consolidated his reign, would come back and try to reassert his authority. So they would get greater and smaller depending on what was going on in the great kingdoms. And in many ways, this was just an extension of what had been going on in the Persian Empire, because there were always places that were breaking away from control of the king. And for example, when you read the Anabasis of Xenophon, he talks about, making his way through Persia. He goes into certain areas which were in revolt against the king of Persia. So this was, not uncommon. Some regions were only locally controlled. Caria, which is down here, and city of Halicarnassus. Lydia, which was the home of King Croesus, Cappadocia, Bithynia. So the successors provided a model of governors who broke away and became independent states. So that's what Ptolemy was. He was the governor of Egypt. So that provided a model for these people. Seleucus was the governor of the satrapy of Babylon. So they had a model of breaking away from the center and trying to form an individual, a independent state, if they had the power to be able to maintain themselves. The great example of this is the state of Pergamum, which was established by a man named Phileteros. He was a native of a city on the coast of the Black Sea. He had a Greek father, or maybe even a Macedonian father, because Phileteros is a Macedonian name, and a Paphlagonian mother. And he became an officer of the Greeks and became what was called the Gazophylax, treasurer for Antigonus. I talked about how Antigonus had amassed that 15 billion pound sterling fortune. Well, Phileteros was the treasurer, who was responsible for controlling that, and they moved that to the city of Pergamon. And he was there, administering that on behalf of Antigonus. Then the wars of the Diadochi continued, and Antigonus died at the Battle of Ipsus, and his provinces in Asia Minor passed under the control of Lysimachus, and Philotaros became the treasurer of Lysimachus. And then Lysimachus died when Seleucus moved into Asia Minor, and then Seleucus tried to cross into Europe, trying to reestablish Alexander's empire, and he was murdered while he did that. And at that point, Philotaros, sitting there in Pergamum with 35,000 talents of precious metal, said, that's it. We're independent. Now, Philotaros really amazingly was a eunuch. And there are stories about that they say that he was, basically, it was a result of an accident. He was crushed in a crowd or something like that. He wasn't someone who was made into a eunuch like the Persians did for people who guarded their harems and stuff, but he had no sons. And if you notice in the statue of Philotaros, he's not wearing the diadem. He never declared himself king. So his nephews, which were Eumenes and Attalus, Attalus the first became the king, and under their rule, Pergamum became essentially one of the richest places in the entire ancient world. Cicero called it the richest part of the known world. And they were tremendous patrons of the arts. This is the statue, it's called the Statue of the Dying Gall, which was commissioned in Pergamum. The rulers of Pergamum, once again, wanted to be seen as having spear-won land, Doricticus Cora, and their war that they won was against the Galatians, who were Gauls, who had first invaded Greece. They were kicked out of Greece by the Aetolians and by Antigonus Gonatas, and they went to Asia Minor, and there they were defeated by Attalus, and this is commemorating his victory. And the Attalids, they became tremendous benefactors of the world. In the city of Athens, there was something there called the Stoa of Atlas. And the Stoa is an arcade which surrounded the agora, which is the public square, the market, and so the Stoa would be where you would have shops, and which really where people would spend a huge amount of their time. And apparently the Athenians were falling on hard times, and Athens had started to become kind of like the Oxford of the ancient world. It was more significant for its intellectual heritage than its political heritage, and people would show their beneficence by donating things to Athens, and Attalus donated this fabulous Stoa, which has been rebuilt. I don't think I had a picture of it, but I thought it was better to put this in. And they built a library to rival the library in Alexandria. And they were responsible for the invention of parchment. Once again, Ptolemy in Egypt controlled papyrus. And papyrus was the paper of the ancient world. And Ptolemy was very jealous of his wanting to be the intellectual center of the world. And he built the museum. I'm sure this is going to be talked about in the next section. And wanted to bring the entire intellectual heritage of the world to Alexandria. The Attalids had enough money to compete with him, so Ptolemy refused to give them papyrus. So they had to invent another writing medium. And so they invented the widespread use of parchment so that they could continue to be in the intellectual business in competition with Ptolemy.
I think that parchment has a name, pergament, right?
Yeah, could be. Could be.
Yeah, there is, yes, absolutely. It's not very common in English, but in other languages, it's very widely used, pergament. If you look in the, I'm sure it must be in a dictionary.
Excuse me, but what is parchment versus papyrus?
Papyrus is made from a plant, a water plant, which is crushed and pulped. And I think it's somewhat similar to the process of making paper. So it's a vegetable which is processed and crushed, and ultimately you get a paper-like substance on it. Parchment is much more expensive. It is animal skin.
Oh,
Paul, just a slight elaboration on that. Yeah, papyrus actually is a reed that's about 2 inches in diameter, about 6 feet long. The papyrus reed is skinned and then cut into slices that are about a foot long and 2 inches wide. And then a set of these slices are glued together in a two layers in a cross-cut array to make a sheet of papyrus. So strictly, it's not paper in the sense that paper is crushed into fibers, whereas papyrus was these long rectangles of this reed sliced thin and then glued together. So when you see ancient papyrus, you can often see the lines between these things. There are broken lines about 2 inches apart, horizontally in particular, sometimes vertically. Parchment is technically, at least, and I don't know whether this is parchment is sheepskin. Vellum is calfskin. I guess vellum came later in Europe, and calfskin was superior to was smoother and thinner than sheepskin. But parchment is sheepskin.
I thought vellum was pigskin.
No. Well, my understanding is parchment is normally sheepskin. Sheep were the main crop throughout the Middle East. Sheep were the main domestic animal. They were bred by the tens of thousands.
Right.
You said something that vellum
is calfskin.
Yeah, I thought it was not calfskin, pigskin.
Okay.
Well, I mean, while we're talking, maybe somebody can take a quick look on Google, and we can resolve this.
Or Ralph, we can do it at 30 paces, and
There you go.
And in fact,
I think I have to agree with Ralph on that. I've
Parchment-
never heard of pigskin being used for writing in Europe.
And parchment was so valuable that there were things called palimpsests, which are documents where people had reused the parchment. They had scraped away what had originally been written on it and then written on it again. And there are scientific processes where they can attempt to recover what had originally been written on it. And that can be a way of trying to recover ancient documents that were otherwise lost. The ancients were big on recycling. So most of the reason that we don't see any ancient bronzes, or very few ancient bronzes, is because they would get melted down to use the bronze. And many stone and marble, in particular architectural stone and marble, would get taken away from whatever temple it was built in and then used to build the city wall or used to build people's houses.
I have a good segue on that. That statue, the Dying Gall, that's actually a Roman copy of the original, which was done in pergamon, and it presumably was in bronze. It's been lost. A great deal of our knowledge of Hellenistic art comes from the fact the Romans admired it so much.
Really? So the Dying Gall is originally Greek, not Roman?
That's a Roman statue.
Yeah.
I know it's on the Capitoline Museum. I've seen it, but
Yes, but the thing you have to understand that when you talk about Roman statues, what you're probably talking about are statues made by Greeks who were slaves in Rome.
Correct. Yes.
Was it made in the Greek period? I'm talking about, there was an invasion of Gauls into Greece and Asia Minor.
And that's why this was made.
So, yeah, I see.
This was made to celebrate the victory of Pergamum over the Gauls when they invaded Asia Minor.
So that's like 278.
Yes,
BC, right. So
that's right.
So it could have been Greek, and Romans just made a copy of it.
Right.
By the way, I looked up. Vellum is made of the calf skin. Okay.
Yeah, I just posted that. Yeah.
Oh,
Ralph,
you did? Okay.
Ralph, you were correct.
Okay. It's really very nice to be able to actually resolve some of these things. Okay, so that's Pergamon, and so Philotaros was quite a guy. I mean, he really pulled this off, and the Pergamon remained independent. It shrank to being just the city limits, and sometimes it was huge, and it occupied most of Western Asia Minor, and ultimately they became allies of the Romans. And we see that a lot of these smaller places, in order to, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, in order to protect themselves from Seleucus, who was the big, the 800-pound gorilla in the neighborhood, they would ally themselves with the 400-pound gorilla, or so it was perceived then, who was quite a distance away in Italy. So the Attalids would ally with Rome to try to give themselves some backing and support to help them resist Seleucus. And ultimately, when Seleucus's, I don't know if it was his grandson or great-grandson, Antiochus III, was defeated by the Romans in Magnesia, which was the beginning of the end of the Hellenistic kingdoms. It was Attalus II of Pergamum who led a cavalry charge that famously broke the enemy ranks, and then ultimately in 133 BC, the last ruler of Pergamum, when he died, in his will, he left his city as a bequest, the entire city as a bequest to Rome. Think about that. The richest city in the world is basically handed over in the king's will to Rome. And I'm sure when we talk about Rome, this is intimately entangled with the story of the Gracchi in Rome. And so we'll refer back to that, 6 months or a year from now when we get to that, to that relationship.
Interestingly, during all of these Macedonian wars and Seleucid Roman wars where Rome participated, Pergamon always sided with Rome and greatly benefited from that union.
And interestingly, lots of other people sided with Rome also. But what they would discover is that Rome had a very short memory. And so Rome's gratitude for your participation in a war on their side would very soon turn into, what have you done for me lately? So, for example, the island of Rhodes was an ally of Rome at the same time that Pergamum was. But when Rome started putting the squeeze on them, they decided to say, well, we don't want to do this anymore. And they were crushed and destroyed. So the Attalus of Pergamum said, well, I don't want to go that way. I'm just going to give up. I'm just going to say, we're going to just become part of Rome, and kind of assuming that the Romans would, give them favorable treatment, give them essentially a franchise and Roman citizenship. And that was one of the really shrewd things that the Romans did, was extend their citizenship to these kings and leaders, elites outside of Rome. So even though your may not have been the best thing for your population, it was the best thing for you. So the kings would consummate this deal. Ultimately, that's how Egypt ended up being a Roman province.
But I also know that Pergamon was very consistent ally of Rome, while
Yeah.
many others, like Achaean leagues or Aeolian leagues, they always switch sides. While
Yeah,
one
the
or the other
Aetolians
in
were the
Rome-
great example.
Yeah, that's right. One time they were for Rome, the other one against, different wars. And
Right. Right. So another example of one of these dynastic kingdoms. We're going all the way to the east now to Bactria, Eukartis the Great. So this is a gold coin minted by Eukartis the Great, king of Bactria, here in the 2nd century BC. He himself was a usurper of another Greek king who is descended from one of Alexander's generals who stayed to govern there, and he actually extended his kingdom pretty far into the Indus Valley in India, current-day Pakistan, before he was ultimately driven back. But this is a beautiful coin, and these exist now. You can buy one of them for about $4,000 or $5,000. A tetradrachma of Eukartis. And so they maintained, these Greek Bactrian kingdoms maintained independence for about 200 years after Alexander left. And that's a pretty large accomplishment in the ancient world. I mean, these empires didn't last that long. So 200 years was a really good run. So now so we have the great kingdoms, we have the peripheral dynastic smaller kingdoms and states, and then we have the cities. These, back to our picture of the cities. Now, the cities were really important to the kings, which is why they founded so many of them, and it was very, very expensive for them to do that. But the cities and the spread of Greeks, well, basically, if I go all the way back just quickly to this map, you see the Alexander going around in circles in Bactria. That's where Alexander slowed down a little bit, because when he'd leave a place, it would revolt, and he'd keep on having to go back and conquer it again. In some places in Bactria, Alexander had to come back 2 or 3 times. So what Alexander did is he started establishing permanent military garrisons. And except for Alexandria in Egypt, these were the first cities that were sponsored or created by Alexander the Great to create basically military colonies to maintain control of the geographic area. It had been a policy of Philip's, and Alexander hadn't had much time for it, but he started doing it here. And the great kingdoms then recognized that this was how you created permanent, the modern word would be sustainability, right? If you wanted to create a sustainable empire, you needed to create people who had power and were supporters of the empire on a very large scale. So the kings started building cities, and it was very expensive. So here, I found this little cute thing. Let's see if I can get this to work.
Old question.
Yeah.
So, but there were existing cities there too. They were not created from zero.
Yes. So, in fact, but if you look at the legend on the map here, you can see that all of the yellow dots are foundations new foundations by Alexander or the Diadochi, and the green by other Hellenistic dynasties. So these cities were all new cities, right? The old cities are black dots: Athens, Corinth, Sparta, Palmyra,
Wow.
right? Ankara, Pergamon. But these were all cities that didn't exist before Alexander, and most of them were built after Alexander. So this is a little cute thing I found on the web, which is what do you have to have in order to be a Greek city, a polis? There were certain minimum pieces of infrastructure that you had to provide in order to have a city. The first of them was temple. So this little thing is broken. They don't have the picture of the temple when you click on it, but you can see the temple. That's one thing you had to provide. Then you had to have an agora, a public square, and very frequently larger cities would have more than one agora. One agora would be a commercial agora for businesses, marketplace, and the other agora would be a civic agora for government and judicial purposes. And the agora would be lined. Let me get back to that. If you see on the lower right, that's a stoa, is the kind of the little brown line, and then backed by buildings behind it. And that's where all the shops would be. And then there would be temples, as we see on the upper left. Then you'd have to have a theater. And the theater was really important because it wasn't just for plays. The theater was the place for large municipal gatherings. That is where the assembly, the ecclesia, would convene. And we should note that all of these cities, this is kind of amazing, all of these cities were founded with a constitution, written constitution. And the written constitution was based on the democratic constitution of Athens.
Paul,
yeah.
just a quick side note. I always found it interesting. The Stoa became the name for the Stoics. The philosophers would hang out by the columns in this marketplace and hold forth. So they became known as the Stoic philosophers. Absolutely.
So we're looking at this theater here, and is a little bit of nerd trivia. The difference between how can you tell the difference between a Greek theater and a Roman theater? And the answer is, first of all, Greek theaters were built to take advantage of the natural terrain. So if those of you who have been to Greece and you've been to the theater at Epidavros, or here, I think this is the theater, it might be in Ephesus, the Greeks would find natural sides of mountains that had a bowl-shaped contour, and they would build their theater here. And the other way that you recognize a Greek theater is that it would be more than, the arc of the theater would be more than 180 degrees, right? It would extend maybe 10 or 15 degrees extra on each side, where Roman theaters would be strictly semicircle, exactly 180 degrees. And the Romans would build them freestanding. I would guess that's largely because of the Roman gift for building with concrete. The Romans were able to build freestanding buildings like no one else in the ancient world because of their discovery of really great material for making concrete in Italy. So this is a real Greek theater. And then you need to have city walls. In fact, it's not a city if you don't have walls. And when you read in ancient texts about the king destroyed this city and destroyed this city and he destroyed this city again and again and again, and then you see a couple of years later, the city is still there. So what does that mean? It basically means that the king didn't destroy the city, he threw down the city walls. So it wasn't a city if you didn't have walls. So to destroy a city, it just meant you demolished their walls. And then to become a city again, you'd have to build the walls up again. Then 5, there's no picture for this, would be the immediately surrounding area around the city, around the polis, would be the agricultural area. And so the people who own land would live in the city and then go out and supervise their dwellings. They typically, by the way, maybe back to this question of Greeks and Macedonians, a Greek farmer was a rentier. Greek farmers did not farm with their hands. Macedonians sometimes did. And that was another reason that Macedonians were considered backward relative to Greeks. They did their own work. They had much more of an egalitarian structure than the Greek world did. So that's the kind of the basic infrastructure that was required to create a polis. And the king would have to build that. And then the king would also have to be responsible for the transit of bringing people from other places to populate his city. And these had to be, well, they wanted Greeks for this because this was all based around Greek culture. And we're going to get into this because at a certain point, the Macedonian, the successor kingdoms in Greece started preventing colonists from leaving. And this created a huge crisis for the Asian and Egyptian kingdoms, and we'll see how they dealt with it. It is really the motor behind Hellenization. So here were all these cities with democratic constitutions. But you say, well, but these were existing inside of these military monarchies. How could that be? And the answer is absolutely. There was a tension between, the polis and living in a absolute military monarchy. The tradition of the polis was that there were 3 freedoms that defined the polis, which the Greek word for freedom is eleutheria. And the first of these was called autonomia, our modern word autonomy. And autonomos, nomos means law or laws, and auto means self. So autonomous means self-governing. That was the first of the major freedoms, and that was by far the most important freedom. And it basically meant that the city wanted to live by its own ancestral laws, customs, traditions, and conventions. The second freedom, I'm not going to go through the Greek words, partially because they don't mean anything, and second, to people who don't speak Greek, and because I can't pronounce them. So what the important words were, the concepts were freedom from tribute. That was the second of the freedoms. And thirdly, freedom from the imposition of garrisons. So the question was, how could a polis fit into this non-polis world of these kingdoms? And the answer ultimately is that it just wasn't that hard. There were tensions, and we would see those particularly in the revolts that would happen in Greece. There was something called the Lamian War, which happened immediately on the death of Alexander. Thebes and Athens got together and basically besieged the Macedonian ruler Antipater in the city of Lamia until that was finally put down. But ultimately, we now look to Antigonus one more time. Antigonus, in his battles with the other successors, came up with, and this is not an original idea, but it was original in that Antigonus really did it. He really meant it. There was this concept called the freedom of the Greeks, which meant the freedom of the Greek cities. And in about 306 or so, I think it was, while Antigonus was besieging the city of Tyre, he made a bunch of announcements, and one of them was he declared all of the Greek cities free. And it meant freedom in terms of the three qualities that I talked about: autonomy, freedom from tribute, though they would have to negotiate that, and freedom from garrisons, and they would lose that freedom if they made trouble. And of course, they were responsible if there was, when the king would call upon them in time of war for contributions of money, they would have to do that. But they weren't subject to tribute the way indigenous places were. The poor people, the non-Greeks of the land, who were at the bottom of the pyramid, what they gave up for getting this freedom was they lost the ability to have an independent foreign policy. Now, one might say, and Professor Billows said this, that they had actually lost, the Greek cities as a whole had lost this ability long before the Macedonians. So all through the 5th century, basically there was Sparta, and there was Athens, and sometimes there was Thebes, and basically you didn't have, if you were a city, you might have an independent foreign policy for a very, very short time, until the Athenians or the Spartans or the Thebans would come and lean on you, and then you would go back into subjugation to their leagues. So this idea of having an independent foreign policy was kind of like a nostalgic memory of something that hadn't existed for hundreds of years, if it had even existed then. And what it meant were that the democratic institutions that exist under an Athenian-style constitution became kind of meaningless, because what did you really have to do? You no longer had a foreign policy. You no longer had a situation where citizens would get up to debate, do we go to war or not? And if we look at, the history of the Peloponnesian War, and we read Thucydides, and he's constantly talking about the conflicts, the political conflicts of the democratic faction of Pericles versus Nicias versus other demagogues. It really mattered to them because they were going to go out and put their lives on the line and fight, and this engendered a civic sense where your activity as a member of a civic body really mattered. Once you got into the Hellenistic world, the only foreign policy that you had left was to beg the king for favors. So you'd beg the king for, could you grant us freedom from this tax and this tribute? Could you grant us this and that special concession? And so the people who became influential in the Greek cities were the rich people with contacts with the philoi, with the friends of the king, who had the ability to actually make some of these things happen. And they gradually became the only people of whose political activity actually mattered in the cities. So even though the cities had these democratic constitutions, in practice, they quickly became oligarchies because that was really all that they had to do for themselves, was to, as I said, beg favors from the king. Okay, there's lots more examples of this, but I'm going to move ahead. I have a lot more to do. The one point that Bill has made about Antigonus's declaration of the freedom of the Greeks. By the way, Antigonus really did it. He really freed those cities, and he did it in Greece as well, and made his son Demetrius immensely popular, and it helped him push back Cassander because it was a tremendous propaganda. That's why I say that these people really were competent and really shrewd. This was a tremendously successful policy, and you can gauge its success by the fact that Ptolemy immediately mimicked it and came out and said the same thing, though with a lot less credibility, because he was occupying cities with garrisons, and Seleucus had to do the same thing. So this was a tremendously effective way of bringing these cities onto their sides. And the majority of the polis, bought into this. Now, so that was hundreds of new cities. How do they fit into the system? So this brings us to what we might call the intellectual underpinning for this whole project. And this was a man, an Athenian, named Socrates. You look, he lived to 98 years of age and was politically active up until his death. And he was considered one of the 10 legendary orators of Greece. And he wrote a document called Philippus to Philip, in which the basic points that he made is, Greece is overpopulated. Now, overpopulation is in the eye of the beholder, but it seemed that way, and talked about I can't remember if this was a quote from Socrates or a quote from Professor Billows, but talked about the idea of a drifting population of surplus troublemakers. There were an awful lot of Greeks who had lent themselves out for mercenary service. So there were a lot of very militarily experienced, tough guys who were roaming around and who needed employment. And so Isocrates first tried to get the Greek cities themselves, Athens and Sparta, to league together and form a pan-Hellenic unit. And no one listened to him at all. They said, what are you, kidding? So he then switched and picked up on Philip as being the savior, if you will, of Greece. And Philip found that this was really well suited for his own plans. This was exactly what he needed, was some, legitimation, some intellectual argument. And he now was able to present himself as the champion of the Greeks, even though he was the ruler of the Greeks. He dominated the Greeks. None of the Greeks wanted him there. But this was, once again, I said that Antigonus was so shrewd, but a lot of it started with Philip. Philip was really the great mind of Macedonian kingship. And so he, as hegemon, his according to Isocrates, his role, his mission, was to unite and reconcile the Greeks. And once that is achieved, what he needed to do was invade and occupy the western territories of the Persian Empire, basically to create Lebensraum, if you will, a place for this Greek surplus population to go on the spear-won land. And yeah.
Sorry, but also Persia was seen as danger to Greece, right? They always thought that the Persians can invade Greece.
Oh yes,
too.
absolutely.
So,
So
I mean, that was a
it was
good excuse too.
yes, well, and it was also the understanding that Persia was tremendously rich. They knew how rich Persia was. I mean, Persia had been basically supporting their favorite candidates in Grecian wars for the last 100 years. Yes. So they knew that basically the Persians had a limitless amount of wealth, and all these things played very well at home. So this was the idea, the intellectual idea. So basic idea is to consolidate the empire via colonization. And there were two ways to do this. New cities, which would be full Greek city-states, which we've gone over here. And the second would be these garrison colonies. So let's go back a second. So these garrison colonies, this was initially Philip's policy when he when he extended the borders of Macedonia into Thrace and into Illyria. He would put in military colonies, and the Romans would later do exactly the same thing for exactly the same reason. Is the way to consolidate control over conquered territories. And it also created reservoirs of manpower for administration and military recruitment. As I said, Alexander started doing this in a big way when he got to Bactria and saw that it was the only way to pacify the region. And then founded many colonies in Afghanistan and Pakistan. As I said, it worked. Greek power stayed intact in that part of the world for almost 200 years until finally the Parthians and tribal confederations in the 120s finally put paid to them. So it was an effective conquest. So functionally, these settlements were garrisons, and the selected colonists were older veterans as colonists. And the idea was that you would settle sometimes entire military units because they already had a cohesiveness of a system of officers. And then when you needed them to serve in the military, essentially you already had pre-existing military units. So they did this all over. And so an example was a place called Theotera, where there is a decree of officers and soldiers at Theotera recording honors to Seleucus, settled a full military unit with the military officers who became municipal officers. At Dura Europus, which was a Hellenistic town in Mesopotamia, there is an inscription which records allotments of lands to soldiers in the unit of Officer X. And Seleucus found and recruited a full unit of Macedonians at the city of Haran. It was the biblical name for it. And it was Carai, which was later where Marcus Crassus met his end at the hands of the Parthians. And so they had this history of functioning together, and they had an organic leadership. So what was in it for the soldiers? The idea is they were given something that was called the kleros, hoplite kleros. And the kleros was basically the means to live a good Greek-style existence, which included land allotments and then some walls and some basic infrastructure, and the use of the king's people. In other words, the king had these lands. He's basically giving them, well, not giving them, we'll see that they weren't given. They were basically, they were provided to them for their use. I think the formal word for that is a usufruct. But they did not own them, but they had the people that were on these lands. And a kleros consisted of 3 different types of land. So the first would be a house in town. You had to have a house in town or you weren't Greek, right? You had to be able to hang out. The thing to stress here is that the Hellenistic world was an urban world. It was an urban society, even though the overwhelming majority of the population lived an agricultural existence in very similar terms to the way they had lived under the Persians and under the Assyrians. They just had new masters. But the society itself, the soul of the society, was an urban-centered Greek society. So you had to have a house in town. That was the first part of your kleros.
Oh, but this is the house in town looks like the doesn't look much of a town.
Well, this is actually built on the top of an ancient theater in Ephesus.
Okay.
Okay. But I just wanted to show, I wanted to find kind of a modest house. I mean, they weren't given huge mansions and palaces, right? They were given a nice house. What we would consider a nice house today, but not a Donald Trump style house. Then the second part of the kleros would be land for growing grain. And this would be the largest part of the kleros. And you see all these people collecting, harvesting the grain. These were not the Greek owners of the land, right? These were the people of the land, the loi basilikoi, the people of the king. And then the third piece of the kleros was a special piece, some sort of specialized piece, and it could be fruit orchards or vineyards or olive groves, or it could be high quality woodland with good lumber, but something special, something that would have a luxury product, a high ticket product that would command a good price on the market. And with these 3 things under their belt, these gentlemen farmers would hang out in town, and many of these garrison towns ultimately were incorporated as a true polis. And here we see them living their lives of Greekness. Greeks don't work in these days. In fact, it was a man, with the exception of a mercenary soldier. A mercenary soldier was an honorable position, but somebody who worked and was paid was considered worse than a slave. Worse than a slave. A free man, by definition, meant a man who didn't have to work. So that was what was created for these people by the Hellenistic kings. But there was some catches. The land grants were contingent. They didn't own them. They were based on loyalty to the king, and the king could and did take them away if he was not satisfied with what you did or who you were. So you had a very strong incentive to be loyal. And obligations for military service, which were also something that the kings took advantage of, because that's one of the main reasons they did this in the first place. And these obligations were inherited by the heirs. Excuse me, please. So it went down through generations. So that was the price for getting the king's benefit and getting this kleros. So that's what was in it for the settlers, for the soldiers. What was in it for the king? This is, by the way, is a statue of Seleucus I, Seleucus Nicator. pretty impressive looking guy and a man of rather amazing accomplishments. Amazing accomplishments. He stood up to some really formidable people and was victorious. And it wasn't until he overreached and decided that he was going to try to conquer Europe that the people around him decided to put him down, because no one wanted a new Alexander. No one wanted a central ruler. So for the king, he, first and foremost, he gained sustainability. He had created a new upper class. And essentially, what you could say is that he'd made these people his accomplices, if you will. I mean, if you go back to the story of Alexander and the pirate, and you say that, well, these rulers of the spear won land were just, pirates writ large, they were just large gangsters. Well, they now had created a whole class of sub-gangsters. And by their loyalty to the king, they maintained the right to exploit the peasants and just squeeze them and maintain their own privileged existence. And so their interests became aligned with the interests of the king. And so this, by far, is the real reason that we see the lasting result of Hellenistic society, how this became the Greek world, is they created a class of people whose Greekness was the basis for their privilege. And they were self-motivated. They didn't have to be told what to do. They would use their human initiative, their individual initiative, to do whatever it took to make themselves rich and comfortable.
Paul, question. With the peasants or the labor, they could make them work and keep them working. But what about the upper classes that there were before? I mean, not the Greeks, not the Hellenics, but the local upper classes. What do? They have a better level? Or?
I think some of them were retained kind of as intermediaries to the local population. They needed people that could speak the local language. They needed people that understood the local customs. And then others of them, they just disappeared. It was, when one gang of drug dealers moves into the neighborhood, the old gang of drug dealers end up dead. And the other responsibility that these people had was, they created markets. So they created the ability to turn this huge agricultural productivity into cash. And so the king didn't have to do that. So look at how the king saved himself from having to have a huge civil service, a huge bureaucracy, a huge network. He didn't need it. He had essentially agents. And I'll say once again, the comparison with Tsarist Russia is very instructive, where the gentry were essentially officers of the Tsar, managing their estates with the authority of the Tsar and the ability to act in the Tsar's name and be judges, to sentence people for crimes. And the Tsar didn't really have to do much except give them these opportunities to be privileged if they would grab it with their hands. And then finally, and maybe the most important part, security. Veteran soldiers. Macedonians were the most valued, but were the hardest to get, especially pretty quickly. It was Cassander that stopped letting, about 318 BC, stopped letting Macedonians emigrate. The Greeks did emigrate for another 20 years or so, and there were tens of thousands of Greeks who left Greece to populate the Hellenistic kingdoms.
Paul, a question on this money, cash, and converting it. What were the standard coins? Were there, was it mostly gold, or were there silver and
silver
bronze?
drachma? The silver drachma. The silver drachma.
Silver drachma, okay.
Right, and they had a tetradrachma, which is worth 4 drachmas, which was like the big bill. That was like the $20 bill. And they also had copper coins, obols, for small change. Tipping the shoe shine boy.
And so the farmers would sell their crops in urban marketplaces.
Oh, no, the farmers,
for cash.
the farmers were, if by the farmers you mean the people who actually worked the land, it wasn't their crops.
Okay, yeah.
The crops belonged to the Greeks, who owned the kleros, who were given the kleros, and these were their serfs, right? So it was the gentleman farmers who would find a market for, turning their crops into coin.
Right.
Okay, so here you have this Greek world, but there was a problem. There are not enough Greeks to go around, especially when, as I said before, the capital for the kings in Macedonia were the people, and they realized that they were bankrupting themselves by letting their people leave, so they stopped letting them leave. And so that presented a crisis for the Asian and the Egyptian kingdoms. And once again, Socrates came in with the intellectual basis for what happened. And he said, and I don't think that he meant it in exactly the sense, but the meaning of what he says is very clear. The name Greek seems to be not that of a people, but of a way of thinking. And people are called Greeks because they share in our education rather than in our birth. So we come now to what was the original title of my talk. What does it mean to be Greek? So what I'm saying is that in the Hellenistic world, you could become Greek 100%. And Greek and Hellenistic culture was one of the few cultures in the history of the world, once again, similar to America, where complete assimilation was possible for people who adopted the Greek language and Greek customs. And that would mean a bunch of things. It would mean, firstly, that you'd have to learn to speak Greek. You would have to patronize Greek institutions, the most important of which, well, we'll get to that. So there were 2 ways that this was done through, in large numbers, through collective assimilation. So military service. So when, for example, when Alexander's veterans who had been fighting for, 20 years or 30 years, first for Philip and then for Alexander, they said, we had enough, send us home. Alexander recruited 10,000 Persians and trained them in what was called the Macedonian manner. And we know this, but what we don't realize is that in a generation later, when you talked about Macedonians, it's not clear whether you were talking about ethnic Macedonians or Persians who had been trained in the Macedonian manner. Basically, they had become Greek. And the same thing is true in the cities. When a new city would be set up, and they'd bring the Greeks in, and there would be a small number of Greeks, because they couldn't get that many. So there was one city, the name escapes me now, where Seleucus settled 5,000 Greeks, which consisted of maybe about 1,000 Macedonians, and the rest were Greeks. And then this is actually Antioch, right? Antioch was actually originally founded by Antigonus, and it was called Antigonea. And then Seleucus, after he defeated Antigonus at Issus, refounded the city and brought in these 1,000 Macedonians and 4,000 Greeks. But he also created a native quarter for native Syrians. And in
Both?
Pardon me?
Sorry. Yeah, but for the Greeks from Thebes and Athens, I'm sure that this was a double whammy. I mean, the double offense, because not only Macedonians are Greeks now, but also outsiders or, you know, barbarous people are becoming Greeks.
But the
We
point
are
is
the
that
Greeks.
they had to become non-barbarous before they could become Greek.
Yeah, but for
They
them,
had-
I mean, the
point
Macedonians were not Greek enough. I
the
mean,
point-
the others will
The
be
point
less.
is that in the ancient world there was no sense of racialism, right? That didn't exist. And if you culturally assimilated, I mean, yeah, there'd be some snobbery, and your blood would matter in terms of your eligibility to be a royal, but in terms of being able to be a Greek,
Alexander spoke the language, unify conquer lands, and he was still not considered Greek. He was still an outsider. He was still someone who was trying to become like us, who live in the polis.
I don't think that's true anymore.
No?
I don't think that was increasingly untrue.
Okay.
And they had no choice, because there just were not enough Greeks. If they had an unlimited supply of ethnic Greeks, maybe they never would have done this. But they were forced to do it. They had no other alternative than to do this. And for the people themselves, you see all sorts of examples of non-Greek people creating myths to try to claim a Greek heritage. So, for example, the Jews in Josephus, I think, some of them claimed that they were descended from Sparta, and there were other native cities, pre-existing cities that converted to become polis, and they would find some mythical Greek ancestor that they would claim descent from. So the Phoenicians would talk about, you have the Greek myths of Thebes and Cadmus, that they were founded by people from Phoenicia. So the Phoenicians said, you see, we're Greeks, right? The Thebans are descended from us. So they would claim these Greek connections in order to make themselves more and more Greek. So Greek language and the depletion of Greeks made this absolutely necessary. The people who were trained in the Macedonian method of fighting were called Pantodopoi, and their descendants became Macedonians. They were no longer called Syrians or whatever they were called then. They were from then on called Macedonians, and they were privileged, higher pay, favorable treatment after service, and Macedonian colonies became full polis within 2 generations. And they had to attend the most important Greek institutions. The most important was the gymnasium. And the gymnasium, I'm not a Greek speaker, but my understanding is that gymnasium means the place to get naked. And this was a big, unique Greek cultural practice. You can't. The first thing that jumps at you when you look at a Greek, vase painting, is that they're usually all naked. Even in the middle of a battle where being naked was a pretty stupid thing to be. Now, they weren't really naked when they fought, but they believed in showing their nakedness as part of their identity of who they were. And this created problems for some of the people who wanted to Hellenize, like the Jews really had a problem at the gymnasium because they were circumcised. And when you read the books of the Maccabees, I don't know exactly how they did this, but they would do something to somehow restore their foreskin or restore something that looked like a foreskin in order to show themselves as being Hellenic. And the another thing that made it much, much easier for them was a practice called syncretism, religious syncretism. And this is something that the Greeks did that made it easy. So the basic idea was the Greeks would go into an area and they would look at who your native gods were and then say, oh, he's like Zeus. She's like Aphrodite. He's like Hercules. But here's the key thing. They didn't change the god. So if you were a native, you worshiped the god that you've always worshiped. They didn't change the image. They didn't change the rites. They didn't change anything, but they had a Greek name. So here we have a statue of Hercules / Melkart, right? Melkart, which is the Western Semitic name of the god Marduk, who was the patron god of Babylon. And you could look at them, with the almond-shaped eyes. This is not a Greek statue, but he's got the lion skin on his head. And so it made it so easy then. You learned the Greek language, you hung out at the gymnasium, you adopted these practices, and there were so many reasons why you'd want to do this, because these were the people that had all the money. These were the people that could hire you to do something if you wanted to have a business. Well, who was going to buy the stuff in your business? It was going to be some Greek, or even if you were really lucky, some Macedonian, who was just basically floating in the money that he had gained through his military service. And you would have to become one of these Hellenized people in order to have contacts with them, to be able to deal with them, to be able to negotiate with them. And we see a number of examples of this in Josephus. Talks about a family called the Tobias, who became tax collectors for Ptolemy. And Josephus talks about one of these Jews who came up with this idea of basically coming to Ptolemy with a package deal. Instead of having a dozen different tax farmers that he had to deal with, this Jewish guy came and said, look, I'm going to do the whole thing for a flat rate. And the Greek kings liked easy. So they gave him the franchise for the whole operation and lent him Greek troops to go and terrorize the local Jews and extract tribute from them. And this was what the process of Hellenization worked. And it was so attractive, it was so profitable, that even when people resisted, so this is probably the most famous case of resistance, and Zach, it took a while, but I told you I was going to get here, was the Maccabean revolt, where the Maccabees, starting with Mattathias and then his son Judas Maccabee, revolted against the Hellenizing Jews. Before they revolted against the Greeks, they were revolting against their own Hellenized Jews. The high priest was named Jason. Think about that. The high priest of the Jerusalem temple was named Jason, not Yohanan or Yaakov. He was Jason, and that was this revolution. But when you look at the kings that descended from them, by the time you get to the third generation that actually said they were kings, Aristobulus. So there's some debate about John Hyrcanus. Is the name Hyrcanus a Greek name? There's scholarly debate about that. But there's no doubt that Aristobulus is a Greek name. And then after that, Alexander Eunaeus, Salome Alexandra, Antigonus even. So these were the anti-Greek rebels who fought a guerrilla war. People compare them in many cases to the Taliban fighting against the civilized cities. And so these fundamentalists, if you will, became had Greek names after 2 or 3 generations. It's one famous historical document is called is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint. The Septuagint is a translation into Greek made, and there's no real hard factual information about exactly when and exactly where, but there's a consensus that it happened in Alexandria, perhaps in the 2nd century BC. But the point is that the translation was done because the Jews no longer could read Hebrew. The Jews needed a Greek Bible in order to stay Jews. They had lost Hebrew. So what I'm saying then, reaching my conclusion here, is that this is a transformation of the world. This was a unique thing. It didn't happen under the previous empires. The Assyrians didn't do it. The Persians didn't do it. The empires before them didn't do it. It happened here. This is how it happened, through the power and seduction of Greek culture and their harnessing of Persian wealth. So, going back to where we started, the Hellenistic statue of the boxer and the classical statue of the Greek ephebe. So the classical statue comes from a time where their art, everything in their society, had a civic purpose. The word idiot comes from a word that means someone who doesn't participate in public affairs, idios, right? Someone who does not participate in public affairs is an idiot. And that was the essence of classical Greece. And it was a life and death thing for the Greeks. But in the Hellenistic world, like those of us today, they became individualistic. They started turning inward on their own psychology, on their own emotions. And we can recognize their fascination with pathos, with pain, with agony, with real people, with individuals. And at the same time, we see in our current society people bewailing the loss of civic involvement in the United States. So we see these, at least it's my argument, that we have these parallels with the ancient world. What does it mean to be Greek? Thank you very much. That's it for me.
Great, Paul.
Wonderful.
Great.
Just wonderful.
Can we ask
Paul. That
about
was
what?
wonderful.
A great presentation, man. Thank you, man. This was
Amazing.
Yeah, Paul, fantastic. I learned a lot of new things.
Oh, fantastic, yes.
As I say, I have to give a lot of credit to Professor Billows. He's a really great teacher, and I just had heads down taking notes for the entire time I was in his class, and otherwise you would not have had a presentation like this.
Yeah.
a question right off the bat. Sorry. So when you're talking about Jews, in particularly, would you say that Hellenization was sometimes the fact that either take my way or the highway, type of thing? So that if the
No, it was not, because it was absolutely something that you had to do voluntarily. because you wanted to. No one was offering it to you. You were dying to get into the club, right? That was your chance to a better life, right? That was your chance to be rich and happy and have a life of leisure instead of being a serf, right? You didn't have to force this on anybody. It was just the opposite.
All those books, the Appian, books, anti-Semitic books in Greece, particularly. I mean, in the bigger Greece, and he was Roman Alexandria. And then, were they just type of things where it was just a mass reacting to something different, not understood?
I think it's, once again, think about today's politics. There are racists everywhere you go. And Appian was the racist of his day. He was the Greek supremacist of his day. And he gradually, his point of view became more and more prevalent until there became pogroms and ultimately the extermination of the Jews of Alexandria. I'll give a couple of examples. Greg is going to be talking about the apology, Plato's apology.
Mm-hmm.
An apology in Greek does not mean I'm sorry, right? An apology really means an explanation of saying, basically a defense. So the apology of Socrates is basically saying why he's not guilty of the crimes that he's accused of, right? Why he was actually a good man, a noble man to be emulated rather than condemned and executed. So that's what an apology is, a defense. And the greatest apologist of the Jews was Philo of Alexandria, sometimes called Philo Judaicus, who lived in the 1st century, and a huge amount of his writing still exists. And he wrote in the most cultured, elevated possible Greek, right? He wrote, like he'd been studying in Plato's academy. And he spent an awful lot of his time trying to explain to the Greeks why the Jews are not really, like the Jews were accused of hating Greeks because they refused to eat with them. And I actually wrote one of my undergraduate papers on this. One could certainly argue that a lot of Jewish law and custom is designed to keep the Jews from intermarrying, to keep the Jews from becoming assimilated and losing their identity as Jews. So the dietary laws make it virtually impossible for an observant Jew to eat with anybody else. You can't do it.
Yeah, but in a lot of cases, I was just reading about medieval Jew, and I want to do something on medieval Judaism, and the thing is, and particularly the anti-Semites in medieval times started with Italy, and before that, people didn't live in ghettos, or they weren't secluded to ghettos in medieval time. It started, like fairly like 1400s or something like that. And they were
Venice was the first one, right?
Correct. Venice was the first one.
And let me say, there was anti-Semitism well before that, and there are stories of Jews being killed en masse by people going to the Crusades. Right?
But the ghettos. What I meant is,
let me just say that I'm saying that I think that medieval anti-Semitism had a lot to do with Christianity. It had a lot to do with
money,
blaming
power.
Jews.
Not only blaming Jews, but the idea that the Messiah could not come until there was a reckoning with the Jews. But yes, definitely blaming Jews for the death of Christ.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Because the explanation
of Muslim countries, like I am from Uzbekistan, we had ghettos, Muslim ghettos, up until the 20th century, until Soviet Revolution came to us. They used to call it Mahala in Bukhara city, which is in Uzbekistan. You'll go in, and for 1,000 years, Jews were secluded, and they wanted to get ahead in the countries like that.
All I'm saying is that you can't. I don't think you can generalize on such a broad scale. I think that you have to look at each of these situations. So when you look at Islam, and I'm certainly not someone that knows a lot about this, but I know that there was a whole history of interactions between the prophet and the Jews of Medina and Mecca. And first they were supportive of each other, and then the Jews rejected Islam when the prophet thought that they could convert. So I'm saying that the roots of anti-Semitism are specific in different cases. They're not the same thing. And so anti-Semitism in ancient Alexandria, I would argue, is not related to anti-Semitism in medieval Europe.
No. My point
It
was,
was pre-Christian.
what I'm trying to say is what I'm trying to say is, you said that a lot of the laws are against Jews intermarrying and stuff like that. The problem is that it wasn't just that the fact in medieval Europe, for example, as an example, up until Venice, the Jews were invited by kings to do a lot of the credit because the Christians weren't able to charge interest and all that stuff. So therefore, Jews were invited, so they were allowed to settle anywhere they want and stuff like that.
Well, but with limitations, right? They were not allowed to own land.
Yes,
there were certain things they were allowed to do, and periodically
there were persecutions because they want to take the money that they have. So
and periodically the king would repudiate his debts and start torturing the Jews. So they were just purely there for, it wasn't any benevolence towards the Jews. They were there because they provided certain resources, and then when the king found that to be, inconvenient, all of a sudden 180-degree turn and things would be very, very different.
Right, but there is no laws. People are sometimes misconstrued it. Neither like in my community, any community I know, there is no laws to like discouraging people intermarrying. I think they just wanted to keep everything like anyone. Italians want to marry Italians.
I don't think you're right. I think that there are Jewish laws against intermarriage. Absolutely, it's a shanda. That's why the words shegets and shiksa have these these derogatory connotations. And the dietary laws, circumcision is designed to make it really, really difficult to convert to Judaism. Imagine in the ancient world, you're an adult, there's no anesthesia. You're going to go and get yourself circumcised. You have to really, really want it. And then you can't eat pork. Pork is delicious. You can't do all these things that are great and wonderful because, and the theory that I ascribe to is that these were basically policies that developed within ancient Judea and Israel, where the primary Israelite society was not monotheistic, that there was a small faction that was monotheistic, and that they developed these practices to keep themselves from being assimilated with the others.
Even secular Jews in a few could be many generations of secular Jews in the family, and still there is a tradition that discourage marrying outside
That's
of
right.
Jewish.
The tradition. It's not something that obviously the circumcision that prevents, like is anywhere else. Also you could say in Christianity there was laws in like for example entering to be a knight, right? You couldn't marry. All those are beautiful things. You want to get married, you want to have kids, you want to have sex. People found there were other ways around it. There was traditions all over the place for everybody. Muslim, you have to do namaz 3 times a day.
I'll tell you a funny story. This is my wife's family. My wife says that when she was a little girl in Brooklyn, that her mother and her mother's sisters, her aunts, would sit around on Easter hoping for rain, so it would rain on the Easter parade.
Why?
So that's
Well, I guess that's
This is, you can't make this stuff up.
No, but can I ask you about the discontinuity? Can I ask you about the discontinuity in the Hebrew language you implied towards the end of the presentation? Because you said that the Jews had forgotten how to speak Hebrew.
The Jews in
What is the
Alexandria had
scope of
forgotten
that?
that. The Jews in